Well, a hybrid team is a combination of people working remotely. So they could be, and in the office. So they could be working really anywhere in the world. And well, actually, they could all be working remotely. So they're just not working together in the one location.
Pre-COVID, I attempted to build my business online. And as a consultant, as a coach, people would often ask me, how can you do your job on the internet? And I said, well, at its core, it's a conversation. But how can you communicate to people via the internet? And I thought to myself, well, we're doing it now, and would be on a Zoom call, or I think before that we even had Skype. And once 2020 hit, it flipped on its head, and people said, well, would prefer you not to come to the office, would prefer to talk to you online. So I think for me, I saw a big shift of that hybrid team coming in around 2020, but it did come along with its own challenges. People wanting to work from home, people wanting to come to work. And I can see that leaders also made a lot of mistakes. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen leaders make building these hybrid teams?
Well, the biggest one would be treating hybrid teams like a face to face team in the office. So there are things that you have to let go of when you have a hybrid team. So, for example, trusting whether people are working visibly. Obviously, that's not an easy thing to do when you're hybrid. And it's not so much about outputs, it's more about outcomes. So there's really a different way to measure productivity when you're working hybridly, and it's also having trust that people are actually working, which can often be very difficult for leaders to get their head around. But we learnt during lockdown that that's really what is needed with leadership.
Coming into the lockdowns, emotionally, how did that impact the leaders as they've had to shift their leadership styles?
Oh, well, it's an interesting one. So it's been, obviously tough for everyone, but if you look at the research, middle managers, really bore the brunt of it because they were really trying to not only look after their teams, but were also getting demands from those all around them as well, up, down, sideways. So in terms of mental health and stress, they're the ones that suffered the most. But it was a big shock to us all, and we all had to manage in different ways. But what I find really interesting about the pandemic is that it's really made us rethink and reevaluate our lives, both work and personal. And we really are going through a cultural revolution in how we work, and we're still figuring things out. But I'm sure in years to come, there'll be more research results into what really worked and what didn't.
I was crossing the street with my daughter the other day, and she said, Dad, what's a revolution? Well, I know she likes Blackpink, and she's been listening to their Blackpink song about revolution. I'd be interested to see, what have you seen visibly? If you went back pre-2020 and now, what is that revolution? Where were we at before? Where are we at in present time?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a definite improvement in the humanization of the workforce. So that was kind of on the outskirts before, but people have really realized and valued leaders who see them, who care about them, who trust them to do work, even if they can't see them, and who appreciate them. And we've seen this really deeper understanding about how we're not just tools of productivity, we're people, we have emotional needs. We don't want to just be treated as someone doing work. We want people who are interested in us and care about us. And lots of research is showing that this has become really important. We really want our leaders to care about our well-being, and our career development as well is something that's really coming to the top. So the days of hierarchical command and control leadership, I know it's still kind of got its tentacles in a lot of leadership practices, but it's really coming undone. And that's what part of this workforce, well, this whole workplace revolution is, and how we work. And, we're still figuring it all out.
Many years ago, I joined Emirates Airline, and I moved to Dubai, and I was working with them. And I would be on board these aircrafts that are worth $500 million. We're flying around the world with 400 customers and 17 crew. And after the service, you'd go to the back of the aircraft and the galley gossip would begin. And they would gossip about the managers and the company and the other crew and their flatmates. And one thing kept coming up was that people felt like they were treated just like a staff number. So my staff number was 394887. So obviously I was like 39,887 in the company. And they'd talk about feeling like being treated just like a number. But for my experience, it was totally different. I had a manager, and I still remember her name, Tanya McMullen, and she was my cabin crew manager. And I would see her at the airport at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. And she personally managed about 300 cabin crew. And all of her crew she knew by name. So my experience was I would show up to a shift. There's my manager at 4 o'clock in the morning saying, "Hello, Daniel, how are you?
Amazing.
How's your fiancée, Ninny? What's she up to these days?" And so I felt like a person. And when they were doing the galley gossip, I just couldn't buy into their model of the world. My perception was my reality, and their perception was very different. But one manager seemed to make the difference, and I knew it was important to be treated like a human. For the people that you're working with in these large-scale companies, what are the team members saying? What's their vocabulary on this topic?
Well, that's an interesting one, and I do a lot of research in companies, and pretty much most companies, I work for decent companies, I have to say. I don't get really toxic ones. They usually don't want to work with me. That's usually ones that are pretty good and just want to be better. But having said that, what employees will say, because I do quite a bit of research in companies, is that they want more visible leaders. So what you mentioned is what people want is a leader that says hello to them, says their name, looks them in the eye when they're talking, gives them appreciation for doing the right thing, doesn't yell at them when they make a mistake. These things are so important. And I have to say, when I remember a few years ago, actually during lockdown, when I was doing a research in a company, and someone said to me, "I just wish my boss would say hello to me when he walked in the door." And I was stumped, because that used to happen to me, 20 years previously, and I thought I was just being a precious little 20-year-old. But it's so important for our well-being, just to know that we're noticed and appreciated for who we are, seen for our gifts and what we contribute. So important.
I personally believe that saying hello is just something that all leaders would naturally do. But I'm very much of a people's person, so that's how I think. And I've been blessed by the majority of my bosses. They've always engaged with me. So I don't personally know how that feels. I could only imagine how it feels. And I could imagine if it didn't happen offline, I could only begin to imagine how people would feel if it's happening online, if they're not seeing their boss physically. Maybe it's hours, days, weeks before they even have that interaction. What's that difference as they move to hybrid? What's happening to that same problem online?
Yeah, well, it's become even more important. So what I found in my research, and visibility, is the key word here, but what I found in my research is it needs to be broken down a bit more. So there's visibility of accountabilities, who's doing what in a team. People want to know that their other team members are working. They don't want to be the only one doing all the work and people are slacking off. So it's really important for leaders when they have their meetings to get everyone to share what they're working, evidence that they're working. It's not just bosses who don't trust their employees. Employees don't often trust one another. There's also, really interestingly, what I found was that people want visibility in decision making. And by that, they want to know why leaders are making decisions that they're making. They want to know the backstory. It's a bit like that quiz show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? People want to know people's thought processes into how decisions are being made. I would have thought that'd be quite boring, but it's actually wonderful when people want that, because they're actually really interested in how their bosses think. And they want to know that so that they can make the right decisions as well for the organization and be in alignment. And they also want to see visibility of leaders being committed to the values. So that's demonstrating the values that they're expecting from their employees. So there's lots of different ways it can be chopped up. Visibility, it's that transparency and people being able to see what's going on. Even seeing the results, like visible dashboards, project management software can be really important when you're hybrid, because then people can see the progress of things and how things are going. And, when things are hidden, people get fearful. That's when there's a lack of trust, is when people can't see what's going on. And that's what we really need to open up.
That trust word has come up many times just in the past few minutes. And we spoke offline about a statistic that I've discovered, and it said that 50% of employees are ready to fire the leader. The other 50% are ready to fire the company. For the leaders, how do they win that trust back?
Yeah, well, once it's broken, it's very hard. But, there are things that leaders can do to improve things. So I was talking to you about the model that I have in my book, Trusted to Thrive, called the Integrated Trust Building System. And it's based on research, so neuroscience research that says that, or discovered that our brains require 3 things to be communicated to us so that we feel safe and trust the situation. So that's safety, both psychological and physical. So knowing we're not going to get hurt at work or, teased if we do the wrong thing. Connection, which is a sense of belonging, so important for our well-being, but also understanding how things are connected in an organization and how we bring value and how that's meaningful in terms of who benefits from the work we're doing. And then stepping into a meaningful future. So people really want to know that the decisions being made for the company are, working well. They're going to have a job, and they want to understand their career development path and, how the company works for them. And, do they want a future with the people in their organization? So, leaders who can communicate those 3 things, not just verbally through words, but also through their non-verbal communication, manage to build trust, which to me and through my research is the beating heart of a high performance team.
So that psychological safety and the physical safety, I can see the importance of that. And I think for most people, they should feel physically safe. But what about the psychological safety? I think that's a totally different game altogether. What's an example in a business where somebody wouldn't feel psychologically safe?
Yeah, well, it can happen in so many ways. Like, it was interesting. I did some work with a leadership team, and the leader thought he was creating safety, and I actually sat in one of his meetings with his team. And what was really interesting was that he'd let them ask questions and he would answer them, but he would get defensive if they challenged him on anything. And he'd almost have a tantrum. So while he thought, and his body language got very closed, and he'd get quite aggressive and he'd lean over. And, he didn't understand that that was shutting people down, because he was making it wrong to challenge anything or just complain about something rather than being curious about it in a kind of non-emotional way. He let his emotions get the better of him, and it was quite obvious he was getting frustrated. Why would anyone want to speak up in front of 25 people that they didn't know if they're going to be treated like that?
Are you putting this in the area of emotional intelligence?
Most definitely, yeah. Being able to, regulate our emotions, have high self-awareness, just the critical skills of leaders.
From your research, are people born emotionally intelligent, or is it a set of skills that people learn and develop by choice along the way?
That's a really good question. So what the research shows is that we can all learn to be emotionally intelligent, but some are more naturally wired to it than others, and that's generally to do with our childhood. I know you use DISC as an assessment. I use the Enneagram, And it's really interesting because that has that's based on numbers, but there's a number two, which is, tends to be more emotionally intelligent out of all of them. And when I coach and train those leaders, they're, if anything, they have to sort of work more to, not be so emotionally intelligent in the way that they get really worried and empathetic about their people, when sometimes they kind of need to let that go. That's not things that they can control. So it's actually kind of interesting. It can work for you if you use it to your benefit, but you've got to learn to control that emotional intelligence as well, if that makes any sense.
So in terms of the Enneagram, the example that you're giving here is that number two more heart-centered, and the previous example, maybe somebody was more head-centered, like a number eight.
Yeah, so it's
What
really
was their
interesting.
style?
Number eight, I think they're driven by their gut more than
The
anything.
abdomen.
But
Yeah, what's eight? Abdomen.
yeah, but they're meant to be the most natural leaders. But I think the research has shown that 10% of people are natural leaders. But I don't know what the research is showing about emotionally intelligent people. How many are naturally like that. But it all depends on your childhood as well, and what you had to use to survive your childhood, if that makes sense.
I know Harvard magazine reports that 85% of the population claim to be emotionally intelligent, yet only 15% are. And I often personally hear this from a lot of employees, is that a lot of leaders lack self-awareness. And when they don't understand themselves, they do find it incredibly hard to understand those subtle differences. In terms of, and if we have a look at DISC, those high D style discs, driving, competitive, argumentative, and they assume that everybody else is just an idiot. But
Yeah.
in terms of those pure disc styles, there's only about 5% of those on the planet, and the other 80% tend to be more the S style. And so they move at a slower pace. It takes a long time for them to build up trust. It could be not just one interaction, it could be multiple interactions over a period of time before they build up that trust. But then the problem is once they do trust too much, they're very easy to be taken advantage of. But they don't speak up. That's one of their challenges. So the boss, those D-style bosses, what I've learned is that you can express an idea, but if you express an opinion, they're going to chop you down like a tree. They don't care. They'll ask for opinions, but secretly they don't want them. And when you give them your opinion, you get crucified. So what we learned here is that for those style bosses, it's better off to give an option. Hey, boss, here's one or two options, and leave your opinion over there somewhere.
Yeah.
And in terms of
No.
psychological safety, people fear that D-style boss.
Yeah, that's something that they need to work on. Yeah, I was coaching one like that, and he had learnt over time, and they do sometimes settle down as they get older. That if you want the most out of people, you got to listen to them and not, assert your style. And I have to say that would have to be the number one thing to build trust, is stop pushing your agenda. Just to, the more we can, learn to accept people for their differences, how they communicate, how they work, how they think, how they dress, their sexual preferences, all that sort of stuff, the more we can accept others for who they are, the more we have to learn, the unique perspectives from other people can be just so powerful for us.
I understand your studies go very deep into psychology, and I want to go deeper in that psychological safety. Many years ago, I heard about a concept of the unconditional positive regard. And it's a state in psychology where the patient feels that their therapist would never judge them. And so they're free to speak about their past and their present and their future without being judged. And what I see in businesses is that leaders struggle building that unconditional positive regard. They don't create that psychological safety where people can offer their opinions or their ideas without that judgment. Could you take us deeper on that topic, on what a leader can do to create that safety?
Well, in the model that I talked about before, so if you imagine safety and connection here, at the intersection of the interaction, so meetings or one-on-ones. So I strongly believe in having a really good structure there that actually always brings in the safety and the connection and the future that a leader can do, particularly with one-on-ones, so the type of questions. And, what the research shows is that, for one-on-ones to work well, it's not about the leader talking, it's about the employee. And in fact, if anything, the leader should only be talking 90% of the time and the employee 90%. So best practice is actually the employee coming in with the questions they want asked and the leader being there to support them in that and really create that beautiful learning safe environment. So it's just turning it on its head, but some of these practices and how you structure a meeting and how you communicate, having a certain way, having an agenda that always has these things just kind of forces leaders to do things a little bit differently and change the results that they're getting.
You also mentioned physical safety. I used to work in a hotel many years ago, and they called it the bloodbath. And there was fights every Thursday and Friday nights, and there was broken glasses and blood everywhere. But I still felt quite safe because I work with some guys 3 times as big as me. And they say, you look after the bar, we'll go fight. And they'd go out and fight, and they thought it was great. And I saw violence in that workspace. I was also attacked multiple times on the aircraft. So we were flying from Dubai to London Heathrow, and we had a disruptive passenger. She drank probably about 500 millilitres of vodka out of her own bottle.
Gosh.
And then she started to turn on the staff, scratching the staff, harassing them sexually. And then we called the captain and said, Captain, we'd like to restrain the customer. And he said, no, Daniel's a big boy. He can manually restrain her. So I had to manually restrain a customer for 8 hours. So she was covered in bruises. I'm covered in bites and bruises. And then it took 3 police to get her off the aircraft. So I stepped forward because I was the biggest at that stage, and I was okay with that. I didn't like it, but I was okay with it. I did another flight to Larnaca, Malta, and we had a disruptive passenger who upgraded themselves from economy class to business class and wouldn't leave.
Nice.
When I went and addressed the person, they spat on me and then gave me a good kick in the balls. But I was lucky because the police saw it and they happily dragged him off and arrested him. There was another gentleman who worked with Emirates, and he got it much worse than I did. The customer was restrained, handcuffed. He broke through the handcuffs, grabbed the crew, and then hammer fisted his face until his face collapsed. Now, it was rare, but it did happen. What are the physical concerns that staff members have? Is it to do directly with their leaders, other employees? Is it with the customers? What's the physiological safety issues you're seeing?
Yeah, well, I should just preface that I wrote a book called Transform Your Safety Communication to help leaders better communicate the importance of safety. And in my work and research on that topic, which is not to do with violent customers, so I don't have any experience with that. But in terms of the research I've done, what people were more worried about were their colleagues, not doing the right thing. So they were at physical risk, whether that was not putting a piece of equipment away properly or, the equipment was faulty, but not saying anything about it. So they got, electrocuted, that sort of stuff. So people, as human beings, we do actually subconsciously, we're scanning the environment to make sure that we're safe, both physically and emotionally. And we don't want to be bullied as well and put our emotional health at risk.